Yes, so thank you for that lovely introduction. It's really nice to be with you all today virtually. We were hoping to do this in person originally, but I think at least this way, actually more people can come than probably would have wanted to come out on a Sunday evening in November. So it's really nice to be doing this. I'm here in Oxfordshire, and so it's nice to see that you're all coming to listen to me from all over the world, virtually in Northampton, and I expect some of you literally in Northampton too. So I'm going to talk about the story of St Raganer, or Ragna, Northampton's unique and really quite mysterious saint. And St Ragnar is a really fascinating puzzle. So as I'm sure some of you know, Northampton seems to have been pretty much the only place that's ever heard of him. I mean, that may also be the case now if you try and talk to people about him outside Northampton. And the only place which really knew anything about him in the Middle Ages. So we really are dealing with a unique story, very specific to Northampton. But we really know almost nothing about him from the medieval sources. And that makes him in lots of ways kind of more interesting, because then the question is, where did this story come from? Who was this saint? So what I'm going to do today is to outline the medieval evidence that we have for the story of St Ragnar, some of which will be a bit familiar to you probably. And then I'm going to explore a possibility of where I think this story may have come from, and what it might be able to tell us about the Viking history of the East Midlands and how that was remembered in medieval Northampton. So the first place to start is with the short Latin text that Jean just mentioned, which gives us pretty much all our information about St Ragnar from the Middle Ages. And this is a text that survives in two 14th century manuscripts. You can see images of both of them on the slide. They're both really pretty in different ways. And this text has two different titles in each manuscript. So in one, it's called The Revelation of St Ragnar the Martyr, and in the other, The Discovery and Translation of St Ragnar. And what this text does is it tells us how the relics of St Ragnar were discovered at St Peter's. So revelation and discovery in each case refer to the relics specifically. And the story that they tell is basically the same. So the image at the top is a manuscript from Yorkshire. It's a manuscript of Bede's history of the English church, and then somebody has added the story of St Ragnar to it. And then the other manuscript is the one that Jean mentioned as coming from Trinity College Dublin. And that's a collection of saints' lives, which probably came originally from the Northampton area. So it's got a number of different saints' lives, including St Ragnar. But the key thing about this text is that it really still doesn't tell us who Ragnar was. It tells us a lot about the circumstances in which his relics were found. That's the story that it's really telling, really interested in. So that's where we have to start to try and solve this mystery. So this text starts by saying that the relics of St Ragnar came to light in the time of Edward the Confessor, so the middle of the 11th century, 1042, 1066. And at that time, this text says, the priest of St Peter's in Northampton was a man named Brunning. And Brunning had a Norwegian servant who is never named in the text, unfortunately, so we don't know his name. But this says, the text says that this man was so simple and kind of innocent and patient that a lot of people laughed at him and didn't take him seriously. But he was very devout, and he wanted to go on pilgrimage to Rome because he wanted to seek the tomb of someone he called his drottin. That's the word this text uses, and that means Lord. I'm going to talk about that word later. So his Lord, his drottin, is St Peter's, because obviously he's attached to a church dedicated to St Peter. He has a particular sort of devotion to that saint. But he has a series of visions on the way. And the visions say to him, it's a bit like the Dick Whittington story, you know, turn back, this is not the right thing to do. Go back, your real Lord, your real drottin is to be found not in Rome, but at St Peter's in Northampton. So he does as he's told, he goes home. Everybody makes fun of him for not having got all the way to Rome on his pilgrimage, so nobody takes him seriously again. But eventually this humble devotion is rewarded when he has another vision showing him a spot in St Peter's where the relics of an unknown martyr lie buried. So he tells people about this and they find the tomb, and then some miracles take place. A woman is healed from illness after praying at the tomb. Bells ring out miraculously, and dazzling light shines from the church in the middle of the night. So clearly something special is happening. And at that point, the priest, Brunning, decides to open the tomb. And what they find is a body and an inscription which identifies it as Ragnar, holy martyr of Christ, a nephew of St Edmund, who died in the same persecution as the king. So I'll come back to St Edmund in a moment. The text doesn't have much more to say after that point. More miracles occur. Pilgrims start to come to the shrine. Edward the Confessor supposedly sends gifts to this new shrine, and that's where the text ends pretty much. So there's a final note just putting those events in a kind of historical context by giving the date of St Edmund's death and saying that 7 years later, the man who killed them, Ivar, was also killed. So that's that's where it ends. So that's all it tells us. And that's almost the complete sum of our knowledge about St Ragnar. There's one reference to him in a source from outside Northampton, and that's from Peterborough. And it's a little bit earlier than the Latin text, because this can be dated to the middle of the 12th century. St Ragnar, or Ragnar, as the name is given in this text, is mentioned in a list of shrines, which was compiled around 1155 by a monk and a historian at Peterborough called Hugh Candidus. That's an image of him from Peterborough Cathedral. And it just says, it's literally just a list of saints' relics, and it says, in Northampton, St Raganer King, his relics are there. So there aren't any more details there, but that suggests that at least in around this time, 1150s, they had heard of St Ragnar of Northampton at Peterborough. So we can push the dating of the story at least as far back as the middle of the 12th century. And there's no evidence that this saint was venerated anywhere other than Northampton, although, as Jean mentioned, we know he was remembered there right through the Middle Ages. There was a chapel or an altar dedicated to him in the church, and his feast day was celebrated on the 21st of November, which is why we're doing this talk this weekend. So I hope you all celebrated his feast yesterday. So that's what we know about the veneration of Ragnar. But it all still really leaves us with the question, who is he and where does he fit into the story of St Edmund? So his feast day falls on the day after St Edmund's feast, which is the 20th of November. So they are clearly being linked in that way. And one of the manuscripts in which the text survives is found, this text is found alongside text dealing with Edmund's life and death. So clearly the interest in St Ragnar is also reflecting an interest in St Edmund. And this link to Edmund's really important. So that's what we have to explore to try and understand who Ragnar may have been. And St Edmund, you may well have heard of, unlike the little known St Ragnar, St Edmund was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, really one of the most important and popular saints of medieval England. So he was king of East Anglia, and in 869 he was killed by a Viking army who then went on and conquered his kingdom. And this period in the 9th century was a time when England was facing attacks from a very large Viking army, or really a number of Viking armies working together, which conquered almost all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one by one. And these were the combined forces of a number of armies. They were led by different Viking warriors, among them two men called Ivar and Ubba. And it's those men, especially Ivar, who are usually named in medieval sources as being responsible for the death of St Edmund. So the story is that this Viking army had already captured Northumbria and they'd killed its rulers in battle, and then they came south to East Anglia and they killed St Edmund. And the traditional story of Edmund's death is that when the Vikings came, they demanded money and his submission to them, but Edmund said he wouldn't submit to them unless they accepted Christianity, which they refused to do. So the Vikings captured him, they tied him to a tree, and they shot at him, as you can see in that image on the right there, until, as the Anglo-Saxon sources say, the arrows were so thick on his body that they looked like the spines of a hedgehog.
Oh my goodness.
Bit of a grim image. But because he refused to renounce Christ, they then beheaded him, and they hid his severed head in a wood so that people couldn't find it, they couldn't bury him. But the story is that a wolf protected his head, and when his people came looking for the body, wanting to bury it, they were shouting out, "Where are you? Where are you?" You know, as you do. And the wolf, oh, no, sorry, and the head answered, "Here, here," so that they could find it and they could give Edmund a decent burial. And because he'd refused to renounce his faith, he was seen as a martyr. So Edmund's story was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages. And these elements, particularly Edmund tied to a tree and then the wolf that protected his head, are really very frequently depicted in medieval art. So these are just some of many, many examples. And the centre of his veneration, of course, was at Bury St Edmund's, where his shrine was. but he was known all over the country. The first account of his death was written down at the end of the 10th century, but he was extensively written about by later medieval historians. And by the 12th century, he had a status pretty much equivalent to the patron saint of England, before St George came along and took over. And one result of this huge popularity was that Edmund's legend grew over time, and new stories were told about him, elaborating on the earliest sources for his life and death. So we have some Anglo-Saxon sources from quite close to the time of what took place around the time of his death, but there are also a lot of later medieval additions to the story. And one of the ways in which the tradition developed was that new saints came to be associated with Edmund, who were said to be his relatives, although they're not recorded in Anglo-Saxon sources. So, for instance, different sources claim that he had a brother called Eadwald, who was a hermit in Dorset, and a nephew called Fremund, who was venerated in the kind of Bedfordshire, Oxfordshire area. And the earliest references to both those relatives are from centuries after Edmund's time. So it's unlikely that either really was related to the king. What we're probably seeing here is local saints being linked up to Edmund because he was so very popular. And the claim that Ragnar of Northampton was his nephew seems to fit into that context too. Ragnar is not recorded in Anglo-Saxon sources, and it's not really a very likely name for the nephew of an Anglo-Saxon king. But because Edmund was such a popular saint by the 12th century, an association with him was meaningful, and if local saints were attached to him, it gave them a place in like a larger historical framework that people could understand. It fitted them into history in a way that kind of made sense. And another way in which Edmund's legend developed, which can help us to understand where Ragnar fits into the picture, is the growth of stories which try to explain the relationship between Edmund and the Vikings who had killed him. So kind of the backstory to all of this, if you will. The likelihood is that there was not any previous relationship between Edmund and the Vikings, Ivar and Ubba, if they were the men who killed him. The Vikings conquered East Anglia. They conquered a lot of places. They didn't need a reason to come and pick on any particular king. So they didn't probably have any special enmity against Edmund particularly. But as the medieval period went on, that kind of didn't seem like enough of an explanation for such a popular saint. So people invented stories to fill in that gap, to explain why did the Vikings kill St Edmund. And those stories seem to have been especially popular in East Anglia, as of course we would expect, but also in the East Midlands more generally. And to understand that, we need to think about what was happening in the generations after the Vikings conquered East Anglia and the East Midlands and settled down in the north and east of England. So you may know that in the 9th century, the Vikings came very close to conquering the whole of England, except Wessex, where Alfred the Great kind of just about kept them out. Alfred made peace with the Vikings, but let them do whatever they wanted in the north of England. So northern and eastern England came under Scandinavian control. And members of the Viking armies settled down in that region. They took lands, they established settlements, they brought their families to join them. And the area where they settled later became known as the Danelaw, a region which at its height reached from Essex and the Thames all the way up to Northumbria, so a really large part of England, as you can see on that map. And the Danelaw wasn't one kingdom, it was made up of a number of regions under different kinds of Viking rule at different times. So there were Viking kings based in York, in Jorvik, and maybe you've been to the Jorvik Centre, which is all about Viking York. And there were Viking kings in East Anglia, and the kings of York also ruled in Dublin. So there was a kind of, their kingdom stretched across the Irish Sea. And Northampton was part of the Danelaw, but it was right on the southern border, as you can see from that map on the right. The border of the Danelaw was Watling Street, the old Roman road, which passes through the south of Northamptonshire. So this region had previously been part of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which founded the Vikings in the 870s, a few years after Edmund's death. The eastern part of Mercia was then under Danish rule, and that was centred in a group of fortified towns known as the Five Boroughs: Leicester, Derby, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stanford, which you can see on the map. And in these towns, new Viking rulers based themselves and their armies so that they could control the surrounding area from those fortified bases. And these rulers were independent to a degree, but they also kind of worked in agreement with each other and with other Scandinavian.
Hey. No. Hey.
Okay. Scandinavian rulers in England, in York and in East Anglia. So the 5 boroughs were an important confederation. And then the area to the south of them also contained several fortified towns which were basically run on the same lines, although not part of that confederation. They were ruled by Viking earls and ruled in the same way. And Northampton was one of those, along with Bedford and Huntingdon and Cambridge. So that's where Northampton fits into the picture in the early 10th century. And then over the course of the 10th century, the kings of Wessex, Alfred the Great's children and grandchildren basically, fought to extend their power northwards into these Viking-ruled areas of the country. And there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of battles, lots of lands changing hands. And since this southern part of the Danelaw, where Northampton is, was a border area, it fell into West Saxon hands quite quickly. So Northampton submitted to Wessex in 917. And then eventually, more slowly, East Anglia and the 5 boroughs and Northumbria also fell under West Saxon control. And essentially that was the formation of the Kingdom of England. There had never been a single Kingdom of England before that date, but now there was, and it was ruled from Wessex. But although the Vikings submitted to West Saxon control, they didn't go away. They had settled in these areas. They were still governing towns like Northampton. Just now they were doing it under the official control of Wessex. So while the actual period of independent Viking rule was not that long, it had a very long-lasting cultural influence on the Danelaw. These Scandinavian settlers brought with them a culture that was quite closely related to Anglo-Saxon culture in many ways, but also distinct. You can tell them apart. But this wasn't an invasion which replaced or drove out the native population, and nor were the Viking settlers kind of completely absorbed into the population already there. Instead, what you get is the development of a kind of mixed Anglo-Scandinavian society, a fusion of the two cultures. And that culture was distinct in lots of ways from the south of England, and it remained so for a really long time, right through the Middle Ages and beyond, really. And you can see this in a number of ways. The really classic example is when you look at the place names of northern England as against the south. Because the Vikings founded new towns, or they gave new names in their own language to settlements which were already there. So if you map places in England which have Old Norse or Scandinavian elements in their names, you can really see a very clear divide. And that line, which you can see on the map there, is Watling Street. So you can see how closely it maps the border of the Danelaw. So the kinds of examples we're talking about are names which end in like the Old Norse ending by, like Whitby or Derby, or Corby, to give you a Northamptonshire example, or name Thorpe, like Scunthorpe, that kind of thing. And there are lots and lots of examples of this, as you can see. And there are quite a few in the area around Northampton. So this is a rough map which I put together of Northampton and the surrounding area. And those blue dots are places with Scandinavian origins. So that shows the likely presence of at least Viking settlers and probably Danish settlers, as we can tell from the language. So you can see that actually there's a fair scattering in Northampton and around that area. We can see the lasting influence of Scandinavian culture in the Danelaw in lots of ways, in other ways too. So in the traditional dialects of northern and eastern England, they are very heavily influenced by Scandinavian language. Many words which originally came from Old Norse, which started as dialect words, actually then spread down into the south of England. So even we southerners use them. And they include some of the most commonly used English words today. So words like sky and window and cake, that kind of thing. There are a lot of, there's a lot of Norse Viking words in the English language. So we know that the Vikings brought their language with them, and we know they brought their art and their culture, but we also know they brought with them stories. So legends and tales and poems. And for the most part, that would have been passed on orally, so they can be hard to trace in the written record. but though we do have surviving poems written in Old Norse from the Danelaw. And over time, we see the development of stories and legends which are specifically about the Viking history of the Danelaw, which ask questions like, why did the Vikings come to England in the first place? Who were the people who led the Viking invasions and settled in these different towns? And what was their impact on this region of England? So there are various stories, probably oral in origin, but eventually written down, which explore these kinds of questions. And they often show marked similarities with sagas and legends we find in Scandinavian literature. But because they focus heavily on England, they're really the product of an Anglo-Scandinavian worldview. They're people living in England, but with an interest in England's Viking history and the Viking heritage of certain parts of the country. And again, there's quite a lot of regional variation within the Danelaw in these stories in terms of where and what they focus on, as I think you'd expect. They reflect local interests. And in the East Midlands, in the East Midlands and East Anglia, a number of these stories centre on a key event in the history of that region, the death of St Edmund. So you might think that after killing St Edmund, the Viking settlers wouldn't be that quick to recognise him as a saint, but actually that's not the case. The Viking settlers quite swiftly converted to Christianity, and it was the Danish kings of East Anglia in the 9th century who were the first people to recognise St Edmund as a saint. They circulated coins with St Edmund's name on them. And that might have been a very shrewd political move, to win the support of the local population by showing that they respected the king they'd replaced. And it's likely that the local population in these generations after St Edmund's death contained many people who were of mixed English and Danish origin. And as time went on, the development... The developing interest in Edmund's sainthood in this region seems to have taken forms which would appeal to such a mixed population. So these start to be written down in the 12th century, but they often have connections with older stories. And as I said before, they often focus on the relationship, the backstory between Edmund and the men who killed him. And this is where we come back to St Ragnar. So the men who killed Edmund, supposedly, Ivar and Ubba, were two of the most successful warriors of the Viking Age. And they had a lasting fame in England and Scandinavia. And they appear in many, many sources from the early medieval period and afterwards. And then from around the end of the 11th century, they start to be identified as the sons of a man called Ragnar Lothbrok. So Ivar and Ubba were definitely real people. Ragnar may also have been a real person, but he turns up quite a bit later in the historical record. And most of what is said about him is legend rather than fact, really, or history. So the historical Ragnar might be a man called Ragnar who attacked Paris in 845. That might be the original Ragnar, but we can't be sure. And we can't be sure if he really was the father of Ivar and Ubba. We're very much dealing with legend here and not history. And you can tell that from the pictures that I've put on the screen. So Ragnar Lothbrok became, I think, one of the most famous Vikings in Scandinavian literature, whether or not he was a real person. There are many stories about him in Norse sagas and poetry. In those kinds of legends, he's a Viking warrior, he's a king, he's a serpent slayer, he has many sons, and they all have their own adventures raiding around Britain and other parts of Europe. One particularly famous story, which is illustrated in the picture on the slide there, is about how Ragnar met his death in England, in Northumbria. The story goes that he was captured by the Northumbrian king Ella and put to death in a snake pit. Those are the snakes that you can see. And with his last words, as he lay dying, he laughed in the face of death, saying that his sons would come to avenge him, so he wasn't afraid to die. And the sons did come, the story says, and that explains why they invaded Northumbria. So Ragnar and his sons feature in sagas and poems from across Scandinavia, but most of the stories about them date from the 12th century and later. That's a point to remember. So these are stories set in the Viking Age, but recorded and circulating several centuries afterwards. And these Norse sagas were not known in England until the 18th century. At that time, British scholars started to rediscover them, started to study Scandinavian literature, and they found these texts and they loved them because they're really exciting. And a lot of the modern image that we have of the Vikings, you know, everything you think of when you think Viking pretty much does come from the stories about Ragnar and his sons. And then, of course, today they are the subject, as you can see on the screen, of the TV series Vikings. That is Ragnar in the middle there, which is partly based on the Norse sagas, although obviously with a lot of poetic license as well. So these are some of the most famous Vikings that people have heard of, both in the Middle Ages and today. And stories about Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons were told in medieval England too, but they're quite different from the Norse tradition. So the Ivar and Ubba of English tradition have some similarities, but the Ragnar figure, their father, is really very different. You know, he is not the serpent slayer of Norse tradition. So that we can see that the traditions are related to each other, but they've developed in quite different ways. So in the Scandinavian traditions, for instance, Ragnar has like 8 sons or more sometimes, but in English sources, he pretty much only ever has 2 or 3, Ivar and Ubba, and sometimes a third. And another key difference between the traditions is that in English stories, Lothbrok is pretty much always connected with the story of St Edmund, who doesn't feature so much in the Scandinavian versions. And that's really important because it suggests something about what English audiences were interested in the Ragnar Lothbrok legend. And the connection to St Edmund is explained by the fact that these English stories seem to be concentrated in East Anglia and the East Midlands, where St Edmund was especially popular. And these English stories about Ragnar Lothbrok also begin to be recorded in the 12th century. So the first reference in an English source appears in a Latin text known as the Annals of St Neots, which was written at Bury St Edmunds between 1120 and 1140, but it later belonged to the Priory of St Neots near Huntingdon, hence the name. And in describing an event set in 878, it says how one of the leaders of the Danes was killed in battle against the English, and the Danes' banner Raven was captured. And it explains, in that battle, they took the banner, which is called Raven, for it is said that the 3 sisters of Ivar and Ubba, that is, the daughters of Lothbrok, wove that banner and prepared the whole thing in the space of 1 noontide. And it is also said that in every battle where this banner is carried, if the victory is to be theirs, there appears in the middle of the banner what seems to be a living raven flying, but if they are to be defeated, then it hangs down motionless, and this has often been proved. So in this source we see Ivar and Ubba and Lothbrok, but already there's a difference from the Scandinavian traditions, because Ragnar's daughters, who supposedly made this banner, are not mentioned in the Norse texts. But the idea of a raven banner, this kind of magical banner that can predict victory or defeat, that is a Scandinavian idea. It's found in lots of sagas, and the raven is Odin's bird, so there's quite a strong Norse connection there. So what we probably have is a combined Anglo-Danish legend here. Very possibly a local legend from East Anglia. I mean, it says it is said that that this banner exists, and that might suggest, you know, oral tradition. But then also the connection between Ivar and Ubba there suggests maybe an awareness of the stories of St Edmund already too. And of course, this is from Bury St Edmunds. So it suggests already there was some interest in the 12th century in recording more information about the Vikings who'd killed St Edmund. You know, Ivar and Ubba, what do we know about them? Who was their father? Yeah, why are they important? And then from the middle of the 12th century, we start to see versions of Edmund's story which offer a variety of different interpretations of Ragnar Lothbrok's role in all of this. And they often give a surprisingly sympathetic account of Lothbrok. So I'll just give you one example, although there are several others. So I mentioned that in Scandinavian tradition, Ragnar famously met his death in England in the snake pit. And that was the impetus for the Viking, for his sons to invade Northumbria. And that is a kind of a really important part of the Norse story because it explains why they came to England. And medieval English sources also have a story about Ragnar's death and his son's revenge. But in this case, it's linked to St Edmund rather than to the Northumbrian king Ella. So they have in common that element of revenge, suggesting that there is some degree of shared origin here, but also the other details are really different. And the English version of the story is first recorded by the chronicler Roger of Wendover, a monk of St Albans, writing in the 13th century. And this slide shows some of the key moments from the story. So this is the story of the Danish man Lothbrok going out in his little boat with his dog. Notice the dog, he's important. He's just minding his own business, going out from the coast of Denmark, which has some mountains which are not very realistic, I think, in this image. But anyway, that's meant to be the coast of Denmark. But he's carried out to sea by a storm and he's shipwrecked on the coast of East Anglia. And so he's taken, he and his dog are taken to the court of St Edmund, and Edmund is very kind to him, and Lothbrok is really impressed by what he sees in Edmund's court. He thinks it's really nice and elegant and sophisticated. So he asks to stay in East Anglia so that he can learn from Edmund and learn how to be a good king and courtly king. And he takes lessons in hunting from Edmund's huntsman. But the huntsman gets jealous of him and decides to murder him. And that's the third image, the huntsman murdering poor Lothbrok. And the huntsman hides his body in a thicket, as you can see. But Lothbrok's dog is faithful and he doesn't leave his master behind. He goes to Edmund and he tells makes the rest of the court aware that something's happened and leads them to discover the body. So you can see that's the last image there, is the dog coming in to raise the alarm and take them to the body so that they can bury it. It's a kind of lassie moment. It's a good story. And then the huntsman is found guilty of this murder and they punish him by setting him adrift in the boat again. And he comes ashore on the coast of Denmark, and there he meets Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, and he tells them, your father's been murdered at the court of St Edmund, and Edmund's responsible, not mentioning that he is in fact responsible. So they are obviously really upset, and they say they're going to get revenge on St Edmund. So they come and invade his kingdom. And then from that point on, the story follows the traditional legend of St Edmund's death. So this story is clearly related in some ways to the Norse versions of Ragnar's death. You know, a king in England responsible for his death causes the sons to want to get vengeance. But the Ragnar Lothbrok character here is really different. He's not a fierce Viking at all. He's just a nice, innocent guy. It's not any of his fault. And we're supposed to like him, really, because he likes St Edmund and Edmund likes him. So he's like a kind of protege of St Edmund, really. And one striking feature of this story is how it imitates aspects of Edmund's martyrdom, particularly in the role given to the dog, who leads to the discovery of the murdered man's body. And that kind of echoes the story of the wolf who guards Edmund's head and allows him to be buried in the usual accounts of Edmund's death. So you're sort of getting the repetition of a really famous element of Edmund's story, which positions Lothbrok and Edmund in quite parallel roles. It suggests they're quite similar, and that Lothbrok is, almost as good as Edmund, really, and they're both innocent victims of undeserved killings. So although the narratives still end in Edmund's death at the hands of the Vikings, this story imagines a much more positive relationship between Ragnar Lothbrok and the English king. And presenting Ragnar Lothbrok's sons as avenging their father's murder, they've been lied to. They don't know that Edmund's not really responsible for it. So they think they're doing the right thing. That helps to explain their behaviour to St Edmund. It doesn't kind of maybe justify it totally, but it gives it a really good and quite sympathetic explanation. So there's some sympathy for them and a lot of sympathy for the Ragnar Lothbrok character. And this story, which was probably originally an oral legend, was eventually adopted at Bury St Edmunds, the centre of Edmund's veneration, and it starts to turn up in 14th and 15th century versions of his story, including the one illustrated here, which is from a 15th century life of St Edmund by John Lydgate, a monk of Bury St Edmunds. And it's a really beautiful manuscript. It was actually made to celebrate the visit of Henry VI to Bury St Edmunds in 1433. So it's absolutely top quality 15th century art. And it shows, you can see that Lothbrok is wearing rather exotic headdress kind of thing there, which is meant to show that he's a foreign pagan character in the eyes of 15th century readers. And there are other stories too which imagine different relationships between Edmund and Ragnar Lothbrok, or his killers. So for instance, there's one story that he married the mother of Ivar and Ubba, and he became their stepfather, and then the mother incited them to kill him. And that's a completely bizarre story, no parallels to that in Norse legend or in other stories of St Edmund. So really a distinctive offshoot of the tradition. But all of these stories suggest a variety of different kind of takes on the character of Ragnar Lothbrok and his relationship with St Edmund. And because they focus so heavily on that relationship and not on what Ragnar might have been doing back in Denmark, they really reflect a specifically English, or more likely Anglo-Scandinavian perspective on the relationship between England and Denmark. And quite a sympathetic one, with some sympathy and interest, certainly in the Viking invaders. So there seem to have been numerous alternative versions of stories about Ragnar Lothbrok and Edmund circulating in England, but predominantly in East Anglia and the East Midlands. First recorded in the 12th century, but continuing to develop and grow well into the 14th and 15th century. And that brings us back to Northampton's St Ragnar. So with the appearance of the unusual name Ragnar and this shared link to St Edmund, it seems likely, I think, that the origins of St Ragnar's story lie in this interest in elaborating on Edmund's death and explaining where the Vikings fit in. Ragnar Lothbrok became reinterpreted in English legend as, for instance, Edmund's protege and friend. The Ragnar of Northampton might represent another version of that tradition, where he's Edmund's nephew. So, we can only speculate about this, but it does seem possible. And that would suggest that perhaps we should look for the origins of St Ragnar's story in the 12th century, and not maybe much earlier than that, because that's when stories about Ragnar Lothbrok first began to be popular in both England and Scandinavia. And there's one intriguing direct connection with Scandinavia in the text which preserves Ragnar of Northampton's story. And of course, that's the Norwegian servant. And this man he's explicitly said to speak Norwegian. And that's kind of an interesting detail, because that wouldn't have been, that's not common. That would suggest not just somebody of Scandinavian heritage, but maybe a recent Norwegian immigrant to England. And that his knowledge of the Norwegian language is quite important in the text. The word that he uses to refer first to St Peter and then to St Ragnar, drotin, that's a real Norwegian word. Often used to describe God or saints, meaning Lord, but used in that context. And that's not a detail that an English writer of the 12th century or 13th century could have made up. I think that reflects a real, a plausible detail anyway. And that meaning of that word is actually quite important in the text, because finding out who his true Lord is really central to this man's discovery of St Ragnar, and then the whole church's discovery of this, this saint. So it's a kind of the starting point for the whole thing. So if we knew a bit more about this Norwegian man, we might know a bit more about the context in which the story of Ragnar first appeared. This man, this Norwegian, seems to have been behind the whole discovery, but we don't even know his name. But it seems certainly possible that there really was a Norwegian man who had come to live in Northampton. Contact between England and Scandinavia, and particularly the East Midlands and Scandinavia, was really common in the Middle Ages, not only for Viking reasons. It was common for trade. Churches in England and Scandinavia were in contact with each other. So, it wasn't all just the Vikings who came to England from Scandinavia. And then in terms of date, the St Ragnar text places these events in the reign of Edward the Confessor. And that to me seems a little bit too early to be plausible, because it's about 100 years before the oldest reference to St Ragnar, the Peterborough reference. And the reign of Edward the Confessor is a period that medieval texts quite often choose as a setting when they want to situate a story in the distant but still recognizable past, because Edward the Confessor was famous. It was the last days of Anglo-Saxon England. People had ideas associated with that. So it was kind of a plausible, they thought of it as a plausible setting. But we might question that and suggest that maybe a more likely time for this story to emerge might be around the middle of the 12th century, which would fit really well with the first reference to St Ragnar from Peterborough, and also with the timeline of the development of the Ragnar Lothbrok legend in England and in Scandinavia. So we might speculate, for instance, that our Norwegian man had maybe heard stories about Ragnar, maybe back in Norway or maybe in England, and he'd been interested in them because of his heritage. I mean, I'm just speculating really. But a mid-12th century date for this story is kind of suggestive and plausible for another reason too. And that is that it's in the 1130s or 1140s when the Church of St Peter's was rebuilt in such a fantastic, incredible Romanesque style. I'm sure many of you know these carvings much better than I do, but the church does have this fantastic array of Norman carvings, including in the centre there, the grave cover, which has often been connected in modern times anyway to St Ragnar's shrine. And it's often the case in medieval hagiography that it's when a church is being rebuilt that you discover new saints or forgotten tombs, as we get in the case of the Ragnar story. And there are logical reasons for that. When you're doing building work on a church, that's when you discover things that might have been hidden, forgotten. You dig up the floor, you find graves, you find objects. And of course, now we would call in archaeologists to come and explain those things to us and put dates on them and explain where they come from. But they didn't have archaeologists in the Middle Ages. And so in those days, it was the people of the church who would interpret what they found and decide what to make of them. And they did often use such finds as ways of interpreting and retelling the history of their own church. So not necessarily in a way which, from a modern perspective, seems historically plausible or accurate, but certainly in a way that was meaningful to them and made sense with their understanding of their own history. So one possibility is that when the church was being rebuilt in the 12th century, they genuinely did discover an old grave, and then whatever was in it, the people who found it, maybe including the Norwegian man, interpreted it in the light of stories that they knew about St Edmund and Ragnar Lothbrok. They would have wanted a link to St Edmund. He was a beloved saint, and a link to him would have been a really powerful thing for any church to have. And it might be then, again, I'm only speculating here, but that the story was written down sometime later after the discovery, perhaps not long before the two manuscripts in which it's recorded, which are from the 14th or late 13th or 14th century. And it might have been then that it was decided to kind of locate all this in the time of Edward the Confessor, maybe out of genuine ignorance about the circumstances of the discovery, and also, again, because you get a link with a saint, another saintly king. Edward the Confessor is a saint too. So the story that the Latin text presents us with is actually probably more complex than it appears to be, and I think therefore more interesting for that reason. And the last point to make is about how significant the Scandinavian links in this story are in the context of the 12th century, and what they might tell us about attitudes to Northampton's Viking history in that period. So the patron who probably assisted the rebuilding of St Peter's was the Norman Earl, Simon de Senlis, Earl of Northampton. And Simon de Senlis is a really interesting part of this story because he was from a Norman family on his father's side, but on his mother's side, he was descended from an Anglo-Danish family who had held the joint earldom of Northampton and Huntingdon before the Norman conquest. And this was the family, it starts with Siward, a Viking warrior who came to England in the 11th century. And Siward was Earl of Northumbria, Earl of Northumbria, but also Earl of this smaller East Midlands earldom centred on Northampton and Huntingdon. And Siward, a Danish warrior, married an English woman, daughter of the Earl of Bamborough, and they had a son, Waltheof. And Waltheof inherited his father's lands and earldom, and after the Norman conquest, he rebelled against William the Conqueror. He then made peace with William the Conqueror and married William's niece, Judith, but then he rebelled against the Conqueror again. He just liked rebelling, and he was executed for that in 1076. And Waltheof was also considered to be a martyr and a saint, at least by some people. And his tomb was at Crowland in Lincolnshire, and you can see an image of that, of the statue of him there. So Waltheof and Judith had two daughters, one of whom was Maud or Matilda, and she married Simon de Senlis. and their son was Simon de Senlis II, the patron of St. Peter's. So Simon II had a mixture of Norman and Danish and English heritage, really interesting and complicated heritage there. And what's quite notable about the Senlis family is that they seem to have retained a real interest in the Viking side of their identity through Siward, Siward's side of the family. You might think that they would want to forget about Waltheof and all the pre-Norman conquest history, since Waltheof was executed for treason against the Normans. You think you kind of keep that in the past, but actually they didn't. They were quite proud of him. And marriages between Norman men and English women like this produced a generation of children like Simon de Senlis II, who had mixed ancestry and were quite often interested in their Anglo-Saxon and their Viking side of the family, their mother's side of the family, as much as in their Norman ancestry. And that really seems to have been the case with the Senlis earls. And we can see this in a fascinating narrative which tells the story of this family, and specifically how they became associated with the earldom of Northampton and Huntingdon. And this narrative was written down at Crowland, but also at Delapré Abbey near Northampton in manuscripts of the 13th century. And Delapré was founded by Simon II of Senlis. So this narrative starts with Siward, and it tells the fantastic origin story about how he came from Denmark and became an earl in England. I won't go into all the details. I do discuss it in great detail in my book, but it involves recognizably Scandinavian and Anglo-Scandinavian stories and motifs being reworked for an Anglo-Norman audience. So we have a man descended from a bear, we have dragon fighting in the Orkneys, we have a raven banner again, and a mysterious character who seems to be a version of Odin. So it's all very Norse. It's really very Norse, but it's all, and these are all motifs we also get in the Ragnar Lothbrok stories. But this is all told in order to glorify Simon de Senlis and his ancestors. So that really strongly suggests that there was an interest in this family's Scandinavian heritage in the 12th and 13th century in Northampton as well as at Crowland, and a familiarity with the Anglo-Scandinavian narrative tradition, of which the Ragnar Lothbrok legends also form part. So clearly around this time, people were interested in telling and recording stories about the Viking heritage of the Senlis family specifically, but also the Viking heritage of the East Midlands more generally. And if that was part of the context in which the relics of St Ragnar were discovered in Northampton, maybe by this Norwegian man, it might well have encouraged an interest in linking them to stories about Ragnar and Edmund. So we don't know for sure. I'm kind of speculating here, but I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the story of St Ragnar is that it suggests a 12th and 13th century audience for whom the story of St Ragnar was an important part of their understanding of England's Viking history and the role that the Vikings had played in the history of towns like Northampton. Okay, thank you very much.
Eleanor, I'm left, having lost my picture. Where are you? Oh yeah, good. I'm lost in a whirl of delight and gratitude to you, just thinking, good heavens, we had to wait 8 years for this, and my goodness me, it certainly was worth waiting for. Thank you so much. Visually delightful, such a superbly clear, well-crafted talk, a cocktail of history meets historiography, brilliant, brilliant local history of the sort of calibre that we long for and Northampton deserves. Thank you so much. Now, what we are going to do now is to take a minute, everybody, because we will have to leave you muted and with your videos off in order to preserve the mostly excellent quality of transmission that we've had. We do have a rogue voice coming in on our transmissions sometimes, so I think that probably was it. Whilst you jot down on the chat menu your questions, which Eleanor has kindly agreed to answer, we're going to introduce now the third member of the evening, lurking somewhere, Bob Purser, our on secretary, our deputy chairman, the co-convener of most of the things that we do at St Peter's. Bob is going to take over the organising, the chairman role for the questions. So if everyone will scribe away on the chat, I forgot to mention it at the beginning, but we don't really want to interrupt the flow and the concentration. I'm particularly delighted to have the interpretation that you've given us of the role of Simon II, the second Simon of Senlis. At the moment, our thinking is that we would put the date of the rebuild, the Norman rebuild, to a little bit later. The whole point about the Norman rebuild is that a good proportion, at least 2/3 of the present building, is superimposed on the Saxon underneath, and it is quite likely that there would be burials which were in existence when the rebuild was done. Some of us get very excited at the knowledge that under the kitchen sink in the left hand, near the priest's door, there is a crypt, which now seems to sit underneath the present altar, the present sanctuary. But the existence of that crypt, it supposedly dates to the 14th century, when there was a stage of rebuild. But in view of what you have told us, I'm even more convinced that we need to get some archaeology onto that site. Eleanor, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bob, are you able to take over now? Where are you? Where are you?
Yes, I'm.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. Over to you to act as the chair on question time, please.
Right. Well, we've got a question here about just for those of us just starting on Anglo-Scandinavian stories, where would you suggest people might start in terms of looking at that? Have you got a book that would get people started on these, Eleanor?
Well, the thing about the Anglo-Scandinavian stories is they're kind of scattered among different, mostly Latin chronicles, like the Annals of St Neot. So there's not kind of one place. But if you haven't read the Scandinavian Ragnar saga, I would definitely recommend that. There's a good English translation of that, and that's really worth reading. So that's a good place to start.
Excellent.
Thank you. And the next one?
Got a question here about, so what made him a saint?
That's a very good question. I think the thing about saints in the Middle Ages is often people, you know, sanctity, sainthood was very much a kind of bottom-up process in the medieval period. So if people thought you were a saint, then you kind of were. And so obviously some medieval saints, you know, from a modern perspective, we would see why that decision has been made. But then quite a lot of medieval saints also, it's hard to see why people thought that they were saints. I mean, St Edmund, for instance, clearly it was the fact that he was killed, you know, he was a Christian and he was killed by pagan Vikings, made people see him as a martyr. But even in the Middle Ages, people could dispute about whether someone was really a saint. So Waltheof, some people thought he was a saint. Some people thought he was a traitor to the Normans who nobody should call a saint. So it wasn't always clear cut, even in the Middle Ages. And I think the problem with St Ragnar is we kind of don't know enough about him to be sure what might have made him a saint if he was a real person, because actually I don't think we can be sure he was a real person. That's the kind of the difficulty or the question. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor.
So I've got a question here, which is, I'll read out. Your description of the church builders and their archaeology was rather reminiscent of St Hugh and his tendencies to steal bits of relics to bring to Lincoln. Was this just ruthless business people in an age before intellectual property?
Well, you can see it that way. I mean, obviously there are sort of financial benefits to having a saint's shrine, but I think it's not just about that. It's also about a community at a church who want to understand their own history, and they don't necessarily have any way of finding out about it. So, you know, they're almost like the Friends of Northampton St Peter's for the 12th century. You imagine they want to know more, but who do you go and ask? You know, what records are you able to consult if you find a grave and you're not really sure what it means? You have to kind of try and make something for yourself. So there's a degree of kind of just making it up, but also it's kind of an important process that communities settle among themselves what they believe their history to be and what they think is important. And that can have a meaning, even if actually it's not very good history. You know, it doesn't have to be 100% historically accurate to be an important part of a community's sense of itself and its own history and who their kind of patron figure is, I think. So it's not just ruthless business people, although there is some of that.
Very diplomatic.
So Suzanne makes a comment that St Edmund reminds her of St Sebastian.
Yes, absolutely.
So martyred with.
Yeah, so St Sebastian is earlier than Edmund, and the Anglo-Saxon sources are very much modelling Edmund on St Sebastian. So they saw that parallel as well, and they compare him to St Sebastian. They're kind of thinking of him as like the English St Sebastian. So yeah, absolutely, there's a really close parallel there. And you can see that in the iconography, you know, the arrows and everything, it's really similar.
And there's a question here about how was Ragnar viewed in Scandinavia? Was he a saint over there?
Oh, no, definitely not. No, definitely not. In Scandinavia, he was a warrior and a Viking, and they thought he was, you know, really cool. Basically, they really admire him, and he was a hero of Viking history, but he was not in any way saintly in the Norse stories. You know, he killed a lot of people and he had like 3 wives, and yeah, no, just not saintly at all. So I think that's one of the really interesting differences between the English and the Scandinavian tradition, that the English Lothbrok is a, you know, perfectly nice character, and the Scandinavian version is much fiercer Viking. So it's really quite different.
Do we have any more, Bob?
I think yes, we do. And a really interesting question. Is there a feminine hero in the story at all?
A very good question. Yes, there are some very strong female characters in the Ragnar Lothbrok story. He has a number of wives who are all pretty strong characters. And if you watch the TV series Vikings, you will know this because they feature quite a lot in that. One of them is a female warrior. You know, she fights in her own right. Another is a princess with quite a lot of political power. And they all play like quite a significant role in Ragnar's life. In the Scandinavian traditions, in the English version of the story, I'm afraid, no, there are no female heroes.